Welcome to the OverAnalyzers. I'm Dan. He's Mike. I'm drinking an aviation, which I'm very excited to try. It was suggested by Trevor. And Mike, what are you drinking?
A whiskey sour, which doesn't sound that fancy, but I've never made one before, so I'm pretty excited.
All right. Cheers.
Yeah. Ooh, it's not the best whiskey sour I've ever had.
This is incredible.
Yeah.
This is really good.
Nice. I should have made
I
that.
made it really strong, but it's really
Yeah.
good.
Awesome. I think I skipped on the fresh squeezed lemon juice, and maybe that was wrong.
Sorry.
All right. So we have for a while been going on and on about this system that we have for remembering things, the spaced repetition and Anki and blah blah blah. And I'm sure people are getting sick of it. But we thought we would take an episode to explain why we are making such a big deal about that. And here's the thing. I think most people are maybe similar to me in that they've heard of this and they've maybe even tried it before. Like I've tried Anki, I've tried spaced repetition a couple times in the past, and I've thought, this is pretty cool. I could definitely see this being useful for certain things, like if you were wanting to learn a language or something like that. And then I just kind of drop it and forget about it, and maybe I used it for a week or two and that was about it. And I'm guessing that many people are probably in a similar boat. They've heard of this, they've maybe even tried it, and it falls into that category of, yeah, that does seem like a useful thing. Oh well, now let's not worry too much about it. So the first question for tonight is, why is it such a big deal to us? Why have we become almost fanatics about it? Like what's changed? I don't know that you've ever used it in the past, but at least for me, like, there's a question to myself, what is different now than before? And what is it that maybe a lot of people aren't doing or getting, or it isn't really clicking with, that's causing them to not be as excited about it as we are?
Well, before we talk about why it made such a big difference for us, can you kind of explain what it is exactly?
Yes.
In case anyone hasn't followed.
So Anki is a very popular implementation of this, I guess, and there's a few others, but the idea is very simple. You take the concept of a flashcard, which is a question that you are shown, and then an answer that you were supposed to think of yourself. So you take that concept, and you review these cards on a very particular timeline, where the idea is that you are shown a card, you have to think of the answer, and then you rate yourself based on how well you think you know the answer. And based on how well you knew it, or maybe didn't know it, that card is digitally, programmatically set aside until a future date. And if you know the card really well, you're not shown it for a little while. And then when you see it, if you know the card really well, again, it's put off for an even longer amount of time. And then if you see it on the third time, it's put off for even longer. So you might see a card in 1 day, and then 4 days, and then 2 weeks, and then a month, and so on. And it gets progressively longer and longer. And the idea, the principle for this is built around this idea of the forgetting curve, where if you are forced to recall something out of your memory, you will remember it for a time. And then if towards the tail end of that time, when it's about to fall out of your memory, if you're forced to remember it again, you remember it for even longer. It's this funny thing about the way our brains work. It's almost like your mind, your internals in your brain decide that, oh wait, this is really important, or it must be important because I'm being forced to recall it, and it strengthens those memories. So that's the concept behind the system.
So why did you stop using it before? Because for me, it was, I'd heard about it before and thought it was really cool, but the idea of having to keep track of all of these weird logarithmic time frames just seemed like an overwhelming task, and I didn't want to keep up with that. So it just seemed like too much work, so I stopped doing it.
Well, had you heard of Anki or those services that kind of do this thing for you before?
Not really. I tried to do it manually with
Yeah.
physical flashcards and then put them in envelopes, and I did this a long time ago, and I didn't really know that much about it, and then I just kind of gave up on it. But
Right. I think the reason I stopped using it is that it felt like it would be really good for certain things, like learning a language, where if, assuming you thought it was a good idea to learn this way, you could write down some word in Spanish and then you have the answer, the English word, or maybe even a picture or something on the back of the card. I think that's perfect. If you're trying to get a whole
Right.
bunch of that type of basic information into your head, then yeah, I mean, the flashcards would be great. But when I start thinking about other stuff that I'm interested in, like I'm not trying to learn a foreign language right now, and I'm not even saying that's the best way to do that. But for something else, like doing software development or playing games or trying to get better at whatever, felt like, flashcards don't really apply there. Like, how do you
Right.
turn, you're an artist, right? Like, it seems absurd that you could take some concept or useful skill in painting and say, let's put that into a flashcard. It's extremely
Yeah.
not obvious how that would ever translate. And so I kind of
And
went, forget it.
I fought you on this
Yeah.
because you started using it first, and you were talking about how amazing and incredible it was. But all of your flashcards seemed so straightforward. Like you just need to memorize this fact, and then it will apply to your
I
your playing. But for me, I just kept thinking, well, mine's all visual because I'm
Right.
an artist.
Right.
So no, I don't want to get into that. But
Well, what's funny is that I think I kind of tricked myself into using it because I started thinking, well, I'd set out this quest to become a grandmaster in StarCraft 2. And so at the start, I'm like, well, this is a huge task. I don't really know how to get better, but I know that I could at least put some basic information in my head that wasn't there before. I don't know how to deal with the rest of it, but for that, at least, I can see how that would be useful, and I at least know what to do about that. So let me just start by doing that. So I have all my cards are on a rough timeline of the very start to what's more recent, and it's kind of cool to go see them evolve because at the very start, it's all that basic stuff. What's the build time for this building, and what time do you need to watch out for this and that, and blah blah blah. Like very simple, straightforward facts. And you can see them slowly evolve to where I start to understand and learn how to start capturing and remembering all these other concepts that are not basic facts, that are much hazier and harder to articulate. And so it has slowly morphed into the most powerful tool that I have, in my opinion, for getting better at this game. But I never thought that that would be the case, and I just thought it would be kind of a simple way of addressing this narrow set of problems. And the motivation was just, well, might as well do that because I don't know how to do anything else.
so you kind of discovered it by accident,
Yeah.
or found a use for it by accident. Yeah,
I-
for me it was.
I discovered the power of it through overtime. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I kind of discovered the power of it. Discovered the power of it at the same rate that you did.
Mm-hmm.
But once you forced me into doing it, because I think I was fighting you a bit, but yeah, the difference it made was kind of like night and day, because it turns out, and maybe this isn't for everyone, but for me, and I guess you too, the things that I was really struggling with was this exact issue, was
Right.
not being able to remember these longer interval pieces of knowledge that you need to know.
Right.
There was just this giant chunk of information that kept getting forgotten over and over again. It's like this blind spot that I had. So
Yeah.
this solved that and continues to solve that for me. And yeah, it totally changed everything for me, I think.
So here's how I have thought about it. This is what I think is happening for most people. To me, it's a bit like if you were going to try to build a house and you started putting things together and you're like, oh, I need to attach this board to this board, or secure this joist. And so you have nails and you have a hammer and you're like, well, I've got this hammer, I'm going to use this hammer. And then you pounded a nail and you're like, wow, that was great, that was a really useful thing, it's really great at putting nails in. And then you're like attaching roof shingles, and again the hammer, and you're like using the hammer for all these different things, like attaching sheetrock. And you're like, man, this hammer's so good. And then somebody else say, hey, what do you think is like really important if I was going to build a house? what do I need? And like, oh my God, the hammer is incredible. It's this amazing tool. You've got to use a hammer. And the other person's like, okay, yeah, hammers are useful. And so they're building their house and they're just kind of walking around like banging on things going, I don't think this hammer's that great. Like, everyone says it's so magical, but you know, as you sit there just kind of slapping it against the 2x4 on the wall, you're like, this hammer's not really quite what it's cracked up to be. And I think you can't go the other way. You can't listen to someone like you or me say, using a spaced repetition tool is this magical thing. It's so useful. If you're trying to learn something, you ought to use it. Because if you just say, okay, I guess I'll start using it, you just sort of do stuff with it. And it feels like you're just whacking random things with a hammer going, I don't know that this is the most useful tool. But if you have a very clear desire or understanding of this is what I need to do, and then you start using this as a tool for achieving that very particular thing, suddenly it starts to really click of, holy crap, this is an amazing way of solving this very particular problem. And you, over time, even learn how to use the tool itself. Like at the start, you maybe don't know how to swing a hammer that well, but after a while, you're like, oh, I know what to do here. I know how to solve this problem. And there's not much else that I know of that is effective in that way at solving that kind of problem.
Right. Yeah, there's a learning curve with the whole thing.
Yeah, a big one, in fact.
Yeah. So, say I've never used spaced repetition system. I'm not familiar with Anki or whatever, but I'm curious to start using it. What do I do?
Well, okay.
It seems really complicated, so
first off, when we say spaced repetition, we're actually not really just talking about spaced repetition. That's a very key part of the system, but really there's a lot of memory techniques that surround that. And there's a bit of an art for choosing what to remember and how to remember it and so on and so forth. So we're kind of using spaced repetition as a catch-all term for, yes, actual spaced repetition, but also all these other techniques that kind of fit around it. But if you were someone who is like, hey, I do think I want to start implementing this kind of thing, the first thing I would do, and I actually think this is a very good piece of advice for anything that you want to start improving, is simply begin to pay attention. And pay attention to what you remember and what you forget in terms of the information that you're exposed to and everything. And that might be some very specific thing that you're working on, or it might be just things in your life and stuff that happens. But begin to notice what information continuously falls out of your head. So if you're trying to learn math, you might notice that the Pythagorean theorem, what was that again? I've looked it up maybe 15 times and it's not seeming to stick, or whatever else you happen to be working on. If you begin to pay attention, you will notice these little bits of information that you are constantly having to recover because they are not staying in your memory. In my opinion, that's step one.
So, for me, before I had this whole thing, this type of thing would happen to me all the time. But
right.
At work, you know, I have to do all these different paintings of all these different things. But every once in a while, I get a painting that includes these Japanese cherry blossom trees. I don't know the exact term for them, but Japanese cherry blossom trees, I guess, will work.
Okay. Sure.
But say I've probably painted maybe 4 pictures with them in there, and I've worked at this place for 4.5 years. And so the first one I got, you know, I had to learn all this stuff in order to be able to draw it and to be able to paint it and get the colors right and the feel of it right. And then all that learning I did just kind of sits there, and then 6 months or a whole year goes by, and then I have to do it again, and it shows up in another painting that I need to include it in. And I keep thinking, oh man, what was all that stuff that I learned about the Japanese cherry blossom tree? I don't really remember. So I have to go back, I have to review it all. I have to relearn everything. And there are a few things you're like, oh yeah, it's that thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, the color does this or whatever. But then you paint it, and then another year and a half goes by, and you have to do it all over again. And it takes an entire day for me to do this.
Yeah.
Whereas all I had to do was review it, a month after I did it just once, or just look at it again, and I wouldn't have to relearn the whole thing. I wouldn't have to spend a whole day on it. And so Anki, or the spaced repetition thing, now all I have to do is put in a flashcard of, think about a Japanese cherry blossom tree. I think about it for a minute or a couple seconds, and that's all I have to do.
Right.
In order to memorize it. So things like that show up all the time.
Yeah, to me, in a way, there's nothing very special about this idea. In fact, it's incredibly obvious. But, well, just in general, I think our society's relationship with education and memory and learning and everything is sort of medieval. Like, we don't talk about even the simplest things, and you can see that as evidenced by the experience you have in schools and how you're never, or at least I was never taught anything to do with memory, which is just the silliest thing. But if you're going to try to remember something, you're going to do spaced repetition. Like, that's, never mind some system or Anki or anything. Nobody thinks that they should just expose themselves to a piece of information one time and then that's fine, and they should never think about it again or review it or anything. Like, if you're going to study for a test, you're going to assemble information and then review it and try to remember it for that test. And if somebody said, hey, that test you took in high school, well, you're going to be tested on that stuff again, then you would go review it, and like, you would somehow re-expose yourself to it and try and resurface that information to remember it long term. Like, that's what you're going to do. The whole concept behind spaced repetition is that you're going to try to do that in the most efficient way possible. Where if you had a bunch of stuff, like you just wrote down everything you ever learned about art and cherry trees and lighting and this and that, then it would probably be volumes of information. And you can't wake up every day and review all of that start to finish. So what would happen is that you just wouldn't do that. Or maybe if something came up and you're like, oh crap, I got to do this painting again, I guess I'll review the stuff I wrote down. But
right.
The idea behind spaced repetition is that if for anything you want to be in your memory permanently, you try and design a system to where you review that at exactly the optimal time, where you aren't reviewing information that you already know and you don't need to review. You're reviewing stuff just as it's about to leave your memory. And so if it's well designed and you're able to do this in a very good, optimal way, then you're essentially doing the most efficient thing that you can in terms of retaining something for a long period of time. Like, it's optimized memory is all it is.
And there's things that happen naturally. Like, there's repetition that happens naturally in whatever workflow you have.
Right.
Where you don't need to put it on a flashcard because it just happens.
Right.
Every time you go to work. Like how to hold a pencil. I mean, I'm using a pencil every day.
Right.
So that's tons of repetition. And I have to lay out a scene with perspective every time. So that stays repeated. I don't have to put all that on a flashcard. But there's certain things that fall outside of that.
Well,
that you need a simulated thing to remind you of that.
Yeah. To me, your memory works with this kind of logarithmic fall off of things. Like, that's just the natural way that your mind remembers things. The way you're presented with things has nothing to do with that curve. In your life,
Right.
Holding a pencil every day, of course you're going to remember how to do that. But that's how that happens to work. Any piece of information, we don't have systems that naturally fall along the forgetting curve. It's just whatever it happens to be. Maybe you encounter something every day and you remember it, or maybe you don't encounter something for 2 years and you definitely don't remember it. So what you're trying to do, like you said, is create this artificial system that puts this information along the curve as closely as you can get it. Okay, I think that's enough high-level talk. Maybe let's talk about implementation. Like, what do you do in particular or how do you use your system? Why? Let's get into the weeds a little bit.
Okay, well, it sounds like the super fancy thing, but in reality, it's literally a free app that I downloaded on my phone. It's called
Right.
Inky app, and I've downloaded a couple different ones, and I can post links to them. But the the app is okay. It's not perfect,
Right.
but it does the job. The interface is a little weak, but it works. It's called Inky app,
Yeah.
and I put in a flashcard. It's real easy. Click new card, type in a question. Actually, let me just find an exact one right now. Sometimes they're really simple. And you should get some of yours ready too. Okay, so here's one. And this has nothing to do with art, but the practice of cutting a tree back to the ground to prepare for future harvest. I think this is coppicing. And yeah, coppicing.
Okay.
So I click flip, it shows me the answer, and I choose easy, good, hard, or fail. And I'm choosing easy because that was really easy. And then here's one more. Picture Andrew Loomis' lower leg and calf landmarks. And that's an exact picture that I've studied before of the lower leg and the landmarks of the calf. So what I'll do for this one is sort of think about it and draw it in my mind. And I can tell, like, I've done this enough to where I can kind of tell what areas are a little foggy and not clear, and which areas are really strong, and which ones would be correct. And then I click flip, it flips, and then it shows me the picture of the thing and a couple notes of mine next to it and everything. And I see it right away, and I go, oh yeah, I messed up this line, and this part was a little askew or whatever. And so I'll just click good. It wasn't easy, it was just good. And it just goes like that through
Okay. All right.
hundreds of these.
But hold on, because those are already, I think, really interesting, and I think we're starting to see what some of the nuances of how you actually need to make this work. So first off, with that very first question, I there's a couple of things that I think are very well done about that question. You said the answer was coppicing.
I don't know if that's actually how you say it, but yes, encompassing.
Okay.
It's the I was reading on a blog, and they said, and it kind of went into this whole history, but basically when you cut a tree all the way down to the ground, and then you allow it to, it stays alive, but it sprouts this new growth, and you just kind of keep cutting that every year.
Mm-hmm.
The term for that is apparently coppicing. And I read that and I go, I am going to forget that. And normally I would think, well, who cares? I don't really care. I'm not like a landscaper or anything like that.
Right.
But I thought it was kind of interesting, and I didn't want to forget it. So I was like, I'll just make a card for that. So I made a card, and actually for the longest time, I could not remember, or I couldn't get it right. Like coppicing, it's such a weird word. Like it's not similar to anything that I really knew.
Mm-hmm.
So after like 3 or 4 times of me hitting fail, I was like, all right, I gotta, like, I have to use one of the other memory tactics.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first thing that came to mind is just this cop jumping on a stump singing and coppicing. And I hated the mental image of that, but sure enough, I remember it every time ever since.
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah,
okay, that's beautiful. So a couple things that I noticed about that. One is that you didn't do it in reverse. You didn't say, what is coppicing? And then the answer is cutting a tree down to the roots. So why is that?
The reason is because the word coppicing is the thing I want to recall. And I knew that in real life, I would see the act being done or see the thing taking place, and the thing that I want to remember is the word for it.
Right.
Why? I don't know. I really don't have a reason for this. I just wanted to learn it. And I think that's actually kind of the cool part of this whole thing. But I knew that in the real world, I would most likely come upon the act being done of trimming these trees or seeing them or whatever, and I would want to think of the word. So I put that first as my cue, and the response is coppicing. So I tried to frame the real world interaction with that thing in the system. Yeah.
So that is a extremely key point of how you want to use this. A flashcard is a cue and response. That's what it is. The question is the cue, the answer is the response. And if you want it to be useful, you have to think very hard about what is the cue that I'm after. You are trying to target something in the real world. The goal is not to be able to answer your own flashcards, right? No one's testing you on that. No one cares. You're trying to get real information in your head, and you want it to be useful and be recalled at the right time, and you want the right thing to be recalled. So doing that is perfect, because you're exactly right. In my opinion, like, you're gonna be out in the world looking at stuff, doing stuff, and you see a tree and you're like, oh, that's called coppicing. Because like you said, the word is a weird foreign word. It's not an easy to remember word. That's the hard thing to remember. So that's an extremely well-designed card, and I think that's awesome. I have an extremely similar one for, I also don't know if I'm saying this correctly, Perovskite, and the card, I can't bring it up because then it'll kill my video feed.
Okay.
But the card is something like, what is that stuff that they're working on right now for solar panels that you could use on a clear window or as a second layer on a solar panel? Basically, it's some solar panel material that's clear, and it you could in theory use it on a building window, and it's called perovskite. And same exact thing. I'm reading some article about solar tech and what's being worked on and what's coming and all that stuff, and I get to the end of the article and I'm like, cool, I'm gonna forget all of this, and that I even read this and everything about this experience that I just had. I read this article and I'm not gonna remember any of it. And we've kind of debated before, what's the, is there a point to me having read that article or not? But no matter where you fall on the more philosophical side of, is it worth doing something if you don't actually remember it, I think it's better if you can remember it. So I thought, I'm gonna make a card about this. And I thought exactly the same way. If I just wrote down what is perovskite, that's a weird word that I am not going to confuse with anything else. I'm going to know exactly what it means, but I don't want that. I want to be able to think, if somebody says, hey, what's going on in solar tech? Or I'm thinking about solar technology, I can think, oh yeah, perovskite, that's that material that's being worked on. And I have a way of thinking about that. And what I think is really fascinating about that is that that's a small detail. It's just a singular piece of information. But by getting it into your head, to me, it's like a dust particle that falls through the atmosphere and it sort of forms a snowflake. It's like things begin to stick to it. And I start to remember other details about, there's this company and they're working on this solar panel that's a couple watts more efficient than what's out there. And like the next article that I read about solar power or hear this or that, it's like the information just plain old sticks better, even if I'm not putting it in a system.
Because the word coppicing, or just knowing that that's what that means, I remember the article now, or, certain things about the article come up, and I'm thinking about, they used to do this, since like primitive times. They have done this forever, trimming back trees, because you actually get more growth that way. And if you cut it like, at above, I think it was above eye level or something like that, it's called pollarding. And I put that one into a card as well. And you would do that and it would sprout all this new growth, and then you trim that down and you have extra firewood. Whereas if you cut the whole tree down and kill it, then you're out of firewoods. But if you cut it halfway down, and also the reason why they would cut it at that level is to protect all the new growth from animals that would eat it. So there's all this weird, random information that gets attached to these two vocabulary words. Right. And yeah, it's like if you find a clue on, oh man, this is dark, but if you find a clue on like a dead body, and they start, analyzing it, you're like, oh, it actually means this and this and this. Yeah. And it's just like the little cards are just these little clues that mean a whole lot more.
Yeah, I still really like your forest metaphor, that a memory is kind of like this path into the forest, that it's in there somewhere, but if the path grows over, you have no way of getting it. So to me, taking some singular little fact, it could be as simple as a vocabulary word, It's a path into the forest, and that leads you to this whole area where there's other stuff around it, and that simple detail actually collects a bunch of other information that you now have access to. And I've
Yeah.
started to find this to be the case in a lot of different areas of my life, where there's stuff that I just can't, like, nothing ever sticks. Every piece of information that comes by, it's like it just falls out of my head and nothing is sticking anywhere. And if I force one of them, say, okay, I did this for, well, this is maybe a longer story, but I got a little bit philosophical about this just for life in general. About I went to Florida, spent some time with dad and family and everything, and myself and dad and Steven and cousin Ryan, we went out to watch a Falcon 9 launch, which is SpaceX's rocket. And we watched the booster land back at the pad. And we were really close. It was super cool. Like, it was a really cool thing to see. And I remember at the end of that, thinking, I'm gonna forget this. Like, I know that I am, because I forget everything. Like, this is a cool day. I'm not going to remember it unless I have to recall it sometimes. And so what had actually happened, we went out twice. On day one, we went out to watch this rocket land, and there was this helicopter that flew right above us, and they were some little tourist helicopter thing, and they were going to watch the launch. And so it's like T-5, or it's getting really close or something like that, and then they call scrub, and it's a range violation, which means that something entered the airspace or the water space or whatever and violated the range. They had to scrub the launch. And as soon as they said that, this helicopter like pieced out. And we're like, whoa, I wonder if it was them. Like, that might have been the helicopter. And so we're kind of talking about it. We go back, we go to the local brewery, have a drink. We're making jokes about, they ought to name a beer after, when a launch gets scrubbed, we should call it the range violation, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, it's just a normal day of my life where this thing happened. The next day we went back, we found out that actually was the helicopter that caused the range violation, which was funny, and they were not out flying that day. And the rocket went up, it was super cool, and that was it. So just this experience, right, in my life. And I remember thinking, this is going to be gone from my memory, and that sucks. That just makes me sad. And so what do I do about that? I could write this giant thing, some 2-page retelling of these couple days and then try to remember that, but like, that doesn't seem practical, and I want to remember other stuff too. Anyway, I'm in the car with Steven, our brother, and we're on the interstate, and this truck drives past, and it has this partially disassembled helicopter on the back of the truck. And he goes, oh, that's the same kind of helicopter that was from the other day. That's a Robinson R-44. And like, the term Robinson R-44 was already leaving my mind seconds later. And I thought, wait, what'd you say that was? And he's like, oh, Robinson R-44. I'm like, cool. So I put that into my system, and the card is a picture of a Robinson R-44. It says, what's this? And the answer is a Robinson R-44. And that was like this hook, or this little attachment point to this entire weekend of everything. This helicopter that kind of in my mind is the symbol of this weekend, of it ruining the first day and causing all this stuff. And I review that in my flashcard system, and it takes roughly 1 second. I see that picture. What's this? Robinson R-44. And I remember reading the Wikipedia article on that, and I remember reading about the other models of Robinson R-44, the Robinson R-22 and the 66, which is a 5-seater, and I remember reading about how there's some controversy because some of the rotors delaminated and blah, blah, blah. And like, this one single tiny name for a thing has started to attach not only information that is, I don't know how useful it is for me to start remembering helicopters and the history of different companies and stuff, but regardless, it's in my head now. And if I see a different helicopter, like, there's something to relate it to. But it also has collected just an experience of my life that's now stored somewhere, because I've selected this very, very simple single memory that has like just attached all these other things to it. So
no, I love that. I think that's exactly what you should use it for a lot of the time. Is it? I like your idea of the hook. It's like
Yeah.
a hook that pulls up this whole,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know,
Yeah.
whole boot shoe or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I like that. That's exactly what it's like. Well, hmm. They don't all have to be. Oh, that one's so simple. It's not big. It doesn't have to be big. It can be anything. I mean, like the coppicing thing. I haven't seen that card in like a month, you know?
Yeah.
But then it pops up and I'm like, oh yeah, all this stuff. It works as both a reminder and
Right.
just a way to remember it.
Right. Okay, so before we get too just lost in the
We
philosophy
just
of
start telling stories of
yeah,
cards.
that we remember because we made a card out of it. That second card that you had, can you kind of reread or recap what that one was?
Yeah, it's imagine Andrew Loomis's lower calf landmark leg drawing, and this is something that I studied semi recently, and it's this little ink drawing of the calf muscle, and I draw it in my mind. I mean,
Right.
you know, not in any weird way. I just try to think through. Yeah, I kind of draw it. You know, I draw this big oval, and then I draw these little lines, and then I do this, and I do that. And then if any area of that, while I'm doing that, seems kind of vague or I'm not really sure, I start feeling that uncomfortableness. I know that I need to go work on that, or I need to, you know, go look that up at some point or review that. And then I click flip, and it shows me the drawing, and I can tell, you know, if I was right or if I was wrong, or if I was 80% right, or, you know.
Yeah. Okay, so that's getting a little bit back into how do you make the idea of a flashcard or this cue response question answer, how do you make that useful for anything other than learning definitions of things? That's a very excellent example, I think, of how you're using it for art, right? So how do I say this? What prompted you to create a card like that? Like, what are you doing where you go,
Okay.
oh, I need to do this as a card?
I have like stacks of sketchbooks, all right, where I have gone through this book for the last, I don't know, 5-6 years or something. I mean, I have studied this book, and every time I do it, it just goes out the window. I mean, it's so complex that I practice it for a while, and then I don't do anything with it, and then I forget it, so I have to go relearn it, and then it just happens over and over and over again. Because at work or my job or what I do, it's like drawing characters happens at such random, weird, spaced out times that every time I do it, I have to go back and relearn everything. And as soon as I start feeling comfortable, I don't do character drawings for another year.
Mm-hmm.
And then I gotta go relearn everything again and again and again. And I could never get anywhere. So this time, instead of like, you know, reading through the books and just like, you know, studying everything all the time, it's like, I'm just gonna take this little leg drawing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to commit this thing to memory. I mean, for real, once and for all, this tiny little ink drawing that I've seen for almost a decade, and I'm just going to commit it to memory. And so, you know, I do a couple studies of it, and I just study the thing, and I try to memorize it in my head, and then I try to draw it from memory, kind of working on it. And then I forget where I was going with this, but I add it to the Anki system, and now I got it. And the reason why I need that is because when I go to draw a character for whatever, or just for fun, I need to be able to draw the back of the leg a lot. Like, that's an important thing to be able to draw. And this gives me the landmarks for that. And so having that in my memory gives me sort of a roadmap on how to draw a leg, or it gives me a basis for that.
Yeah.
So that's why I committed it to memory. But
So here's what I think. I've done very, very similar things. I'll have a card that says, visualize what you would do in this situation if you're playing Starcraft, or what happens if the opponent does or attacks with the depths. Like, and the answer is not the kind of answer you could ever put on a test. I think we're all a little bit programmed by school in terms of what the about how you can encode a piece of information. I know that sounds kind of weird, but if you're taking a test, somebody else is grading you. They are having to observe, in a sense, what's in your head. So they ask you a question, and then you have to give an answer. And the answer can't be ambiguous. It has to be a concrete, straightforward answer. Who was the first president of the US? That was George Washington. And that's just what we're used to. That's how we operate. And that's the kind of approach that you would tend to bring to a system like this. Whereas if you're looking at a little drawing or piece of art, your first instinct is, that's cool. That's not, how do you make that into a question and answer? That you can't say. You could take some other piece of information. You could say, who drew or who made this drawing, and then you could answer that. But that's not the piece of information you're trying to remember. You aren't necessarily concerned about Andrew Loomis. You're concerned about you being able to recall the drawing, the form, all that stuff. So we've been calling these, I think, good faith cards or something like that. But essentially, you know what it is you're trying to recall. If you create a prompt or a cue, and then you decide if you're able to recall that to your satisfaction, that's all you need. Nobody else is trying to check and make sure that you answered it correctly. Like, it's just you. That's it. So you can capture almost anything if you think of things that way. If you think, in this situation, or if I'm thinking of this, these are the pieces of information that I want in my mind. And I was talking about this on Discord to somebody. Playing this game, Starcraft, I kept messing up this little action, like this series of buttons and clicks. And I knew what I was supposed to do. I press this key, I do this thing with the mouse, then I press this key. Like, I know what it was, but I kept messing it up. And I sat there for a while just doing it over and over, and like trying to experience the physical sensation of what it feels like when I do it correctly. And then I try to describe what the physical sensation is of me doing it correctly. And I have some kind of nonsensical thing of what the question is, what are the metaphors for what it feels like to execute this little command? And then the answer is like, draw a circle, and then picture at the top of the circle me pushing down with this finger, and it's almost like this little kind of wave pattern. Like, it's nonsense, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
Because I know what I'm trying to capture. I'm trying to capture this very particular physical feeling that you cannot articulate in words. So I have to come up with some random symbols and things, but I know what they are. And I know when I'm picturing that correctly. And that has resolved a problem that I never would have thought to try and take a flashcard approach and on a spaced repetition timeline to resolving a physical mistake. But the idea that you can cue yourself to mentally simulate something that's very abstract, that is not some kind of literal answer to a literal question, is unbelievably powerful. And that's I think one of the biggest strengths of that system.
One of my cards, I think, is draw the metaphysician's hand. And the answer is oven mitt curve. Because when I'm drawing a hand in the position that the Heinrich Klee's metaphysician's hand is in, I need to think of it like an oven mitt, and the top fingers are curved, and then the bottom fingers are curved a different way. And so the answer for me is oven mitt curve.
Right.
And that makes sense to me. And then I'm able, just like a hook, it brings out all the other info that I need, and then I can draw it. And the only reason I really do that is because if you're drawing any hand in that position or a similar position, if I can jump back to that thing, I can adjust it to fit whatever I actually need it for. But remembering that base helps me.
Yeah.
So
that's awesome. I love how weird and confusing and nonsensical that is to me, because I think that's a really key part of what we're actually talking about, is trying to capture and store and keep in your memory those kinds of things.
So why did this make such a big difference for you? I mean, if you're just memorizing like a couple extra things, like could you not memorize things before? Why is it so different now? Why has this made such a big difference?
Well, that it's a very good question. Um, there's a few parts to that answer. One is that yes, I could memorize things before, and I've known about different memory techniques and things like that. It's not this giant lightning bolt revelation. So, okay, couple things. First, even if I knew how to memorize things, it doesn't mean I necessarily did, or even really thought about the memory question. Like I said, if you just begin to pay attention, you will start to notice how many things you constantly have to relearn because you constantly forget them. And this, I kind of got to this point after just a period of frustration. Like, this is so stupid. I keep forgetting the same things. So I probably could have said, okay, yes, I got to remember all this stuff, and I don't necessarily have to use spaced repetition. Although, like we said, I think you're pretty much always using spaced repetition. It's just not very efficient. Like, you're going to write stuff down and review it. So just the step one was, okay, I keep forgetting things. That's a problem. I can fix that stuff. And then as you become more and more in tune with this feeling of, oh, there's this concept, it might be hazy, but I've experienced this before and I forgot it again, or I'm having to rediscover it, and I don't want that. I want to be able to keep these things in my head. Having this tool that I know is effective for certain things, and then thinking, I think I'm going to try to apply it to this problem of me not thinking the right way or conceptualizing the right thing. Like we said, it's, it turns into this card that's extremely non-literal. So I think the difference was, first, understanding that remembering things is an absolute priority. It is possibly the most important thing when you're trying to learn something, is keeping the information in your head long term. I mean, it sounds very simple, but it's actually incredible how much we don't even necessarily think about us retaining information. We don't in school, right? Like, you learn stuff for a test and that's it. And a lot of us, many of us, you shove the information into your head right before the test, which actually works really well because, there's a forgetting curve. And if you shove it all in and then take a test just, one step further in that curve, you're very likely to not be forgetting very much. Like, cramming is a great strategy. But long term, it's a terrible strategy because you're reviewing stuff once, right? Like that. We don't think that much about memory. So for me, step one was just starting to bring a lot of my own attention to the stuff that I'm forgetting and how much time I'm wasting relearning the same things over and over, and then starting to learn effective ways of, okay, how do I do this stuff, and how do I encode weird things that are not simple facts. Well,
Right.
how does that feel like an answer to that question?
Yeah. I think that's great. So the thing I was thinking about is that every new, whatever you're doing, there's a certain amount of things that are being repeated, and you have down and you're very good at. But if you want to introduce something new, by definition, it is not repeated, right? Because it's new. It's never been repeated. It's not part of your workflow. It's not part of anything. It's new. It's just something you want. So you go and learn this new thing. You add it into your routine, or you add it into whatever you're doing. Like, if I learn, I don't know, a new cool lighting effect, or a new method of doing something, like, I want to add it in,
Right.
but I don't I may not technically have a real need for it, other than I want to use it. So I might use that for a week or two, but then it might slowly start just disappearing from my workflow, and then
Yeah.
I don't even it just doesn't even occur to me that I ever learned it, and I just go right back to the same way that I've been doing things, because that's how I've operated for a long time, and that's what feels comfortable. So unless you have some outside force or some need bringing that new thing up
Yeah.
again and again, it just goes away. And so that's what was happening for years. I kept learning new things, but I didn't have a super strong need for them. Like, Uh, Trevor in our new cocktail bartending Discord chat, he mentioned that mixing cocktails is a mix between, or a balancing act between three things. And it was acidity, sweetness, and bitterness, right? So it's a balancing act between those three things. And I read that and I go, oh, that's cool. And then the next day, I'm about to make a drink and I'm like, oh, what was that thing he said? And I can't recall it within like 2 seconds. So I'm like, I don't know. And so I just go right back to what I've always done, right? Because I don't have a huge need for this. I have ways of coping with this because it's new. It's new information. It's not that important to me. So within that 2 seconds, I'm like, what is that? What did he say? Like, what are those three things? And then, something else happens. Beep, the microwave's done, or I got to take the dogs out, or whatever happens. And so I go do that, whatever that is. And I never recalled the information. And so a couple days after that, that is gone. Like, it's lost forever. Like, I will never be able to remember that until tonight, when I'm like, what was that thing that Trevor said? I want to be able to remember that because that's kind of cool. So, I make a flashcard. What are the three things that, all cocktails are sort of based on? And it's balancing acidity, sweetness, and bitterness. And now I have that in my system, and I will never, ever forget it as long as I keep up with this. So I think that's pretty cool.
But I actually really like that you framed it that way. I super big time agree. So at first I thought that me playing Starcraft was kind of special, and that it's this really fast real-time game, and it has its own particular difficulties, and it does for sure, but I was experiencing that exact problem. And I think that you put things into your head, you develop a way to think about pretty much everything you do. Some of it's very conscious, a lot of it isn't. You're taught something, you try something, go, oh, this worked, this is what I'm going to do, and so on. And you just have this very streamlined way of operating all the time, whether you're mixing a drink or doing anything, playing a game. And your mind, it works in real time. Like your thoughts are moving and switching and just chugging along. And it's like you said, if you have this new thing of, I want to think a little bit differently about the way a drink works, if you have that written down in a notebook in a drawer, that doesn't work its way into your mind. It needs to be right there. Like it's actually kind of difficult to get your thought trained to take a different path. Like you really have to have it right there and available and be ready to take that path right in the moment. It's a hard thing to appreciate until you really start observing the way you think and the way you operate. Like with this game that I play, I have sat there and thought, oh, I have this awesome new strategy. It's going to be amazing. I'm totally going to just, beat everybody with this cool new thing. And then I go to play a game and I'm like, oh, wait, I was going to do something different 5 minutes ago. Oh, well, never mind. Like you're so reliant on these very optimized things that you do. It's difficult to get yourself to think differently. And using a system like that is how you do it. Like you get things into your mind. And then the other, I think, more subtle part, and this is also a part of an answer to your previous question of why was this such a big deal to me, is that I have started to realize that you can practice a lot in your mind. You can rehearse a drawing by thinking through it and by simulating the actions and things that you do for whatever it is you're targeting. And so like with this game that I'm playing, I can put something in my system and say, the cue, the prompt of the card is think about how you would handle this situation, and think about it in the highest resolution possible. Think about where your fingers go and what that actually physically feels like, and think about the look of things on the screen, and try to play the game in your mind to rehearse this thing and actually work this new behavior, this new information into your brain in a way that's actually really hard to do. That's I think a big, very subtle, very hard to really get across point of that whole system.
So when you first started telling me about how you're using it with StarCraft, I couldn't see how it would relate to art, right? Which now seems really stupid because there are so many ways that I can relate it to art. And there's tons, I mean, just basic factual information that I need to retain. So I should have seen that right away. But what about everyone else that does other things? Say, like, what if you want to be a really good ping pong player? How do you think you could use an Anki spaced repetition system for being a good ping pong player?
Well, I don't know for sure because I haven't tried that kind of thing. But I I will say this. I'm into powerlifting. We've talked about that a bit, although I haven't been doing quite as much lately as I would have liked. But in powerlifting, you do three lifts, three movements essentially, and the whole goal is that they're always the same. You're not trying to improvise and mix it up when you're doing a squat or a deadlift. You're trying to do it in the most optimal way, exactly the same way every single time. That's the sport. So you would think that on day one of powerlifting school, they say, well, do this with your legs, put your arms here, this and that. And like, that's pretty much it, right? Like, how complicated is a bench press really? Well, it turns out it's really complicated, and I'm still struggling to get certain things down. But I thought, okay, at first, I think that the idea of using this spaced repetition system and other memory things might be useful for a tiny subset of things that I'm working on. I'm going to use the tool for that with Starcraft, right? And then over time, it's like, holy crap, I can actually do an insane amount of stuff with this. And it's what I use for almost everything that I'm working on in Starcraft, right? But even then, I'm like, well, it can't be that useful for powerlifting. I mean, it's purely physical, but it's not. There's actually a lot of mental cues, and there's a lot of issues that I started to identify of, you know what, when I set up for a squat, I'm not too sure exactly where my feet ought to be. Or there's these very kind of odd sensations like in your core, and sometimes it feels pretty good, and sometimes it doesn't feel all that great. And so I'm watching videos and instructional things from really high level powerlifters describing this stuff, and some of it didn't make that much sense, but other times I'm like, oh, that cue, this idea of trying to squeeze your hands together in just this particular way, and like that's a cue that I want that to enter my mind as I set up. And so I have actually a bunch of cards that have to do with powerlifting, of what exactly should you think at this moment in the lift. And it's, in a way, it's really hard because I'm having to, you know, the grooves are pretty well worn. Like, I have my way of lifting, and I've identified that, you know what, that my way of lifting isn't that great, and I need to work in this new way of lifting. So I want to think about this and that and that and that. And like, there's this whole series of things that should be in my head as I execute the lift. And so I think that the answer with, I haven't tried to apply this really to a sport like ping pong, but I think if you were, or table tennis, I think is actually the preferred term. I think ping pong is a brand.
All right, table tennis.
I've just, someone corrected me on that recently.
Or pickleball, right?
Right, pickleball, yeah, which is a whole new thing. I think what you would do, like I said, step one is just to start observing. You know, do you make frequent mistakes over and over, and why? Some of it could be fairly literal and obvious. Of, oh, when I play this opponent, they have a weak, they call them backhand and forehand in table tennis, or pretend they do. Sure. Yeah, it's like, they have a weak backhand. I need to remember to do this at this time. And then everything we said before applies. Like, you're trying to mentally simulate that situation. You're trying to work this new behavior into your head. So some of it might be straightforward like that. Others might be the kind of thing like your card about of emit curve that doesn't mean anything to anyone else, but maybe there is some physical sensation that you know feels right when you hit a ball the right way. And maybe you notice that, oh, if I'm losing my footing or I'm scrambling, then I tend to get flustered and I'm not able to capture this physical sensation. So maybe you need to think through, what exactly would that feel like? And or maybe you need to not hit that kind of shot if you're on the back foot and struggling, or who knows. And I've hardly ever played table tennis, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But first, just observe. And if you see patterns of, I keep doing this thing wrong, or inconsistently, you might be able to resolve that by trying to, and I'm not saying it's easy. It actually takes a lot of thought to think, how do I, what is the right sensation, and how do I give that a name, and what are the mental symbols for that? But if you can capture that and you can say, okay, I'm going to commit this to memory and I'm going to mentally simulate it and review it frequently enough to where it does not fall out of my mind, then I think you actually could make a lot of great improvements there.
All right. If you start doing this, do you make separate decks for all of your cards? Because you have the option of being able to make different categories. So do you think it's better for you to group everything together and just think of it as the memory of your brain, or is it better to categorize it and treat it as different areas?
So I don't know that I have super strong feelings on this, because this was a question that came up from a few people.
Right.
I think it's really important to be able to get information into the system with very little friction. I mean, I have a thing set up on my phone, and it's literally like I touch that, and then I type in the question, I hit enter, I type in the answer, and I hit enter, and that's it. Like, it's, other than me typing the letters, there is one other action that I have to take, which is tapping that icon on my phone. I try to get that down to the absolute most optimized thing ever. So in terms of categories, if there's any kind of mental overhead of, oh, I want to make a card, but like, should I put that in my, mixed drinks category, or my miscellaneous category, or my general lifestyle category? Like, that's not the point. Don't mess with that too much.
Right.
So that to me is really important. In terms of how you want to categorize things, I don't know. Do whatever sparks joy.
But that mentality of keeping things simple and keeping things easy, I think, is
right,
incredibly important. And that you don't want to put in a card where you don't know the answer and you have to go learn the answer. Like, if you have a question that you don't know the answer to, you probably should not put that into the system, because if that comes up, you're stopped. Like, your review is done and you must go solve that problem. And I don't think that's how it should be, because you just destroyed, or you just paused your entire review. And until you solve that problem, everything is on hold.
Right.
So I think you should avoid that as much as you can.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point too. I think if this is part of the just learning how to use the system type of thing, but if you, well, step one, you want to be able to get information in very, very fluidly and easily. But another important thing is that you want the review process to also be very, very fluid and easy. In my opinion, it should feel like you're playing a game of trivia where you always know the right answer.
Right.
It's like this god tier run at trivia where you're always right. And that is actually how it is supposed to work. You're supposed to be seeing stuff right before you forget it. So go ahead.
Well, I had one card that was list all the bony landmarks of the leg, and there's 14 of them.
Yeah.
And so I'd have to go through the whole thing, like Great Trode Chanter, Medial Epicana, whatever. And I had to go through all 14, and it just took forever and kind of bogged down. I removed that card because that's just too big. And once I get to that, if I don't have time, I don't want to sit there going through the entire thing. So it'd be much easier to just break it into 2 or 3 different cards.
Yeah, I think that's actually great. And I've done the same thing. If I have a card that's just too big, or sometimes it's not even big, it's that the answer to the question feels, it's like I'm more trying to remember what I wrote down than the actual answer.
Right.
It's kind of vague. It's not, it just feels kind of messy that you're not really remembering the right information. So a big key part of it for me is to constantly reevaluate and break up or change or get rid of cards. And like, you're really trying to maintain this very well thought out, streamlined, very easy to review thing. And it just, in general, smaller is better. I think you're trying to queue and then respond with very small pieces of information. Because I
Yeah.
think that's how you think anyway. You don't see a queue and then it's suddenly a million things pop into your head. Like there's a few key things, then you might think harder about one of them and that leads to others. But that's almost like a queue and response in and of itself. Like you're trying to capture these very simple relationships of queue response. And so they should be small and it should feel actually fun to be reviewing them. And that's probably what a lot of people get hung up on, is like you said, you hit this card of name the 14 things in the leg and you're like, ugh, I don't really want to do that, or it's just
Right.
kind of too much, and then that sort of kills the whole momentum.
Right. Like the other day I was going through and it's just like, question,
Right.
response. And it's just it's like if you were scrolling through Instagram and liking every picture. You see the
Yes.
picture, you process what it is, you like it. You go to the next one, you see what it is, you process it, you like it. And you just keep going and going and going. And it feels great.
Yeah, it doesn't crush
And
your
that's
soul
how
like
it should
Instagram
feel.
does.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't crush your soul like Instagram. You feel, healthy, like you're eating vegetables every time. And
Yeah.
it's just great.
Yeah. Actually, that has this is a conversation for a different day, but it'd be great if we could try to design things that are not soul sucking and evil, that we do habitually. But this has become kind of like that for me. One of the questions that Emily brought up in our Discord was, how do you review? Do you have, is it at 8:15 every morning? You sit down for half an hour and review? For
Yeah.
me, it's that it has almost become, I won't say a compulsion, but like it is habitual in the same way that opening Instagram is, that it's right there on my phone. I do it all the time. And as long as you're smart about it and you keep things very small and fun and simple, then I can pull it out, do 2 cards in 20 seconds or less, and then be done. So
Right.
it's almost like I never tend to build up that much because it's always this hook of, oh, I could just do one. I could just do two. And then, 10, 15 questions later, I'm like, oh, the queue is clear. There's none left.
It's really fun to be right. I mean, in
Yeah, yeah,
anywhere, at any time, it's always
yes.
fun to be right. And this gives you the chance to do that. And if you set it up right, you just feel good doing
Yeah.
it. I mean, some of them are more challenging, but that's what you're trying to practice. But it just feels so damn good to be right. So
Yep.
I open it. There's sometimes a stretch of a few days where I don't touch it, but normally I'm opening
Right.
it. Okay, so last question that Emily also asked was, are you afraid of having too many cards? What if you make 1,000,000 cards? Are you able to keep up with that
Right.
forever, or does that crash and it totally ruins the forgetting curve and you're just everything's useless?
Well, I might have to deal with that when it gets to 1,000,000. Right now, I'm at 646, which is a lot, but it's certainly not tens of thousands. Part of the design of the system is that you are not, if you put a card in, it's not linear. You're not having to now review that card every single day. It gets exponentially longer. So eventually you're seeing that card once a year or something like that. So
Right.
if you're only reviewing a piece of information once a year, you can hold a lot of information and you still have a very minimal time. And maybe you can stretch it out to 2 years or something like that. But I haven't, my philosophy so far has been that anything I put in the system, I'm reviewing it along this timeline. And even though it's very simple and easy, it is still taking time and attention of me doing that. So in a sense, everything is high priority in that I'm just reviewing all of it and trying to maintain it. And stuff does naturally eventually settle into this longer term format. But there could be stuff where, let's say I achieve my goals in StarCraft and then I say, okay, I'm not quite as concerned anymore with pushing my boundaries, or I would like to go pursue other stuff. Maybe I don't need to be reviewing however many hundreds of cards I have around StarCraft. So I don't know. There might be some value to retiring cards. There might be some stuff that you just don't, you remember it up until some point and then you say, okay, I don't need this information anymore. Like I have a bunch of cards on in StarCraft about maps that were cycled out last season. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to retire all these because I'm not playing these maps anymore. I don't care about that. So there might be something like that. Like you could decide when to cycle things out of the system, but in general, I think it's designed to accommodate a huge amount of information anyway. So part of the whole design is that it is okay to put tons and tons of stuff in there.
Yeah, because if you make 100 cards in one day and you review all of those 100 cards in that day, some of them are going to be easy and some of them are going to be harder. So the
Right.
easy ones get pushed, so 20 of them will occur again in a month.
Right.
20 of them will occur in a week, and so on.
Right.
And so
They
it
kind
gets
of naturally
totally
spread out.
dispersed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like if you got 100 golf balls and I don't know why I went to golf balls, but you hit the golf balls and they just scatter all over the course. That's kind of what it's like.
Right.
And then you don't ever really run into them all again in one area.
Right. So the answer is right now, no. But I can't imagine there might be some techniques, if it does begin to feel burdensome, where you could prioritize certain things and not others and that kind of stuff. I mean, you're using Anki, and that's what we are recommending to people. Like you said, it's great, but it is lacking in some ways. I have programmed and designed my own system, which is really great for me. There actually is a GitLab repository if anybody wants to goof around with it. I've written it for myself. It's like a command line tool type of thing. So unless you're just really down for it, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you want to experiment, you can. And what's nice about me having rolled my own is that I can, in theory at least, begin to experiment with some of that stuff. Like having a way of saying, this is a high priority item, this is a low priority item, or maybe there's like timed items where I say, I want this to be remembered for a year and then it gets archived, and so on and so forth, stuff like that. So that could be a fun thing to work with, because just in general, this whole area feels like there's Anki and a couple other things that do sort of similar things. And you use Anki and you're like, this is okay. I mean, the system is great, but the app could be better.
I downloaded NeuroCache, which is another one.
I messed with that, actually.
Okay, the interface I loved. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
I don't know if did you agree with that, or?
I think so. I don't remember it super well.
So I put in about 10, 20 flashcards and I loved it. I mean, it was so easy to use and everything. But, you can't, or at least from what I understand, you could not put in a picture, which I need the pictures.
Yeah.
And there was a couple other things that you can't have unless you sign up for the premium thing, and then you're paying monthly. Yeah, so I haven't found a perfect one. I don't know. I think you should just make an app, but I don't think I can afford to hire you right now. So I don't have a perfect one to recommend, but there are tons of them out there. A lot of them are free. Just download one.
Yeah. Well, and here's my thinking with that. It feels like an area that's underappreciated and under-researched.
Yeah.
We have tons of note-taking apps where, there's, what's the one everybody loves?
Well, there's like Evernote, and there's Obsidian.
Obsidian was what I was thinking of, which is, it looks really cool. I have kind of my own system that I like, but I can see that being great. Like
apparently Obsidian has a plugin that does
which
this too, so
is probably worth checking out too. But
yeah.
It feels like we have put so much effort just as a society into note taking and how important that is. And then, oh yeah, there's this spaced repetition thing that you can use sometimes, it's cool. But to me, like, they're equal levels of important now. To me, the idea of note taking, which I have done for many, many years, and I find utterly essential, like this system of spaced repetition has risen to where it is just as important. And I think that the world has not quite embraced that yet, or really understood how powerful it is.
Yeah, totally agree.
So go use it. That's
it's so simple.
Yeah.
I mean, like, the things you can do with it are incredible, but the actual act of using it, like, I mean, I could sit here, download an app, make a new card, click flip, and then I'm done. Like, that's it. It takes 5 minutes. So
yeah. There is a learning curve. We'll say that. And I do think that the step one is to just start paying attention, start noticing your memory, start trying to understand what you remember, what you don't. It's very, very revealing when you do. And then use a system like that. Okay. Anything else?
Oh, we have a book club starting up on let's just say the first of next month. We got a book club. We're going to be reading Ultra Learning by Ultra Learning, Master Hard Skills, Outsmart the Competition, and Accelerate Your Career by Scott Young. We have not read it, so
Yeah.
we
Right.
don't have any thoughts on it, but I
And-
kind of wanted to read it, so that's what
Right.
we're doing.
And this will be a Discord book club where we'll have a channel and we'll read it and talk about it and stuff like that.
Yeah,
That's
so
the
if you
plan.
haven't joined the Discord, join the Discord.
Yeah.
Discord.
And you can read a book with us. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for listening. Everybody go use spaced repetition. Seriously, it'll change your life. Thank you. Leave us a review, leave us a comment. We love those. You can email us at the OverAnalyzers podcast@gmail.com. We'll see you next week.